The cafeteria of Galactic Youth Academy buzzed with the sounds of 100 different species eating their midday meals in Kira.
Hey.
Chen sat alone at her usual table in the corner where she could watch without being watched too closely, and she picked at her food with careful movements that had become second nature over the past 6 months. She had learned to move slowly here and to speak softly and to never ever show the full strength that her human body possessed, because the other students frightened easily and their bodies were fragile in ways that still shocked her, and a handshake that felt normal to her could break their delicate bones, and a pat on the back could bruise their soft tissues. The Velians, with their gossamer wings, trembled when she walked past too quickly, and the Thoraxians, with their crystalline structures, clinked nervously when she raised her voice above a whisper, and even the sturdy Melundi gave her a wide berth after she had accidentally dented a door. Framed during her first week and everyone had stared at the bent metal and Horror Earth, was classified as a Class 12. Deathworld and humanity had only been accepted into the Galactic Council 5 years ago, and even then it had been a controversial decision because some species thought humans were too dangerous and too violent and too unpredictable to be trusted. Among civilized spacefaring peoples, Kira understood their fear even if it hurt, and she worked hard every single day to prove them wrong, and she got good grades, and she volunteered to help other students, and she never lost her temper no matter how many times she heard the whispers of Deathworlder. When she passed in the hallways, she was reaching for her water container when movement caught her eye and she saw Zekther, Kravaxian security guard, approaching through the crowded cafeteria, and his 6 legs moved in that clicking rhythm that always set her teeth on edge, and his armored carapace gleamed under the soft light. Zekther had never liked her and Kira.
I knew it, though.
She could never figure out exactly why, and he found reasons to stop her in the halls and question her about where she was going, and he watched her with his compound eyes during assemblies. And he made comments just loud enough for her to hear about Deathworlders who didn't know their place. She tried to ignore him as she stood up with her tray, and she turned toward the recycling station, but Zekther was suddenly there, and closer than she had realized, and her shoulder bumped against his armored thorax, and her tray tilted, but she caught it before anything spilled. "I'm so sorry," Kira said immediately, and she stepped back and lowered her head the way the cultural guides had taught her, because many species saw direct eye contact as aggressive. "I didn't see you there, and I should have been more careful. You dare strike a security officer." Zekther's voice crackled through his translator, and it was loud enough that conversations around them began to stop. "You Deathworlders think you can do whatever you want here?" "No, sir. I really didn't mean to." Kira kept her voice level and calm, even though her heart rate was increasing. "It was an accident, and I apologize, accident." Zekther moved closer, and his mandibles clicked in what Kira had learned was contempt. "Your kind are always having accidents and breaking things and hurting people, and you think apologies fix everything." The cafeteria had gone completely silent now, and Kira could feel hundreds of eyes on them, and she could see her few friends at a nearby table, and Prism the Shardling was half risen from her seat with concern radiating through her. "Crystalline structure, please, sir. I don't want any trouble," Kira said, and she hated how small her voice sounded. "I'll be more careful in the future." "The future," Zekther said, and there was something in his tone that made Kira's instincts scream danger. "Deathworlders like you shouldn't have a future here." His armored appendage moved faster than Kira expected, and the edge of his secondary limb struck her across the face with enough force to snap her head to the side, and pain exploded across her cheekbone, and she tasted copper as her teeth cut the inside of her mouth. For a moment there was only shock, and the cafeteria seemed frozen in time, and Kira's rational mind tried to process what had just happened, while something older and deeper in her brain began to wake up. She had been struck, and struck hardened by someone bigger than her, who clearly intended harm in every instinct that kept her ancestors alive on a world of predators and poisons and natural disasters. Suddenly roared to life, her adrenal glands dumped their contents into her bloodstream, and her heart rate doubled and then tripled, and her muscles flooded with oxygen and glucose, and her pain receptors shut down, because pain was information her body couldn't afford to process right now, and her pupils dilated too. Take in every photon of light. Kira turned her head back slowly, and she could feel blood trickling from her split lip and running down her chin, and when she looked at Zekthur, her vision had changed, and everything was sharp and clear and outlined, in a way that let her see every possible threat and every possible target. The other students would later report that her eyes had gone completely black and that the change was instant and terrifying, and unlike anything they had ever seen, and some of them would have nightmares about those eyes for months afterwards. Orc saw 2 and 4 just a moment. His confidence flickered because he realized he had made a terrible mistake, and this small human who had been so careful and so gentle and so controlled for 6 months was looking at him with eyes that held no fear and no hesitation and no mercy. "You forget yourself, Deathworlder," Zekthor said, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Now I am authorized to use disciplinary force against students who..." He raised his appendage again, and perhaps he meant to strike her again, or perhaps he meant to call for backup, but he would never complete the motion. Because Kira moved to the watching aliens, she seemed to simply appear in a different location, and her hand was locked around Zekthur's descending limb, and there was a sharp crack that echoed through the silent cafeteria, and Zekthur's translator screeched in pain. The humans who would later review the security footage would see that Kira had simply ducked under the strike and stepped inside Zekthur's reach and caught his limb before it could build momentum, and the crack was the sound of his exoskeleton fracturing under the grip of her Deathworld's strong finger. Zekthur tried to pull back, but Kira moved with him, and her other hand shot out and grabbed his weapon harness, and she twisted her body in a motion that looked almost like a dance, and suddenly the massive security guard was airborne. He hit the ground hard, and Kira was on top of him with her knee pressed against his thorax and his weapon in her hand, though she didn't remember taking it, and she could hear alarms beginning to wail and students screaming and running in. Then the red haze began to clear, and rational thought started to return, and Kira looked down at what she had done, and the color came back to her eyes, and horror replaced the cold calculation. "Oh no," she whispered, and she released Zekthur and dropped the weapon and scrambled backward. "Oh no, I didn't mean to. I'm sorry." But it was too late, and the damage was done, and as security teams poured into the cafeteria and surrounded her with weapons drawn, all Kira could think was that she had just destroyed everything humanity had worked for and proven every fear the galaxy had about her kind. The security teams surrounded Kira with their weapons drawn, and she kept her hands raised and visible, because she knew how bad this looked, and she could see the fear in their eyes as they stared at the human who had just taken down one of their own in less than 3 seconds. They bound her wrists with restraints designed for dangerous criminals. They were careful not to touch her more than necessary, and she could hear them whispering to each other about Deathworlders and violence, and whether backup was needed, and one of them kept his weapon trained on her head the entire time. Kira let them lead her away without resistance, and she could see her classmates pressed against the walls and windows, and their faces showed shock and fear and something else she couldn't quite identify, and Prism was shouting something, but the guards pulled Kira through the door before she could make out the words. They took her to a detention cell deep in the Academy security complex, and the cell was designed for violent offenders, and the walls were reinforced Durasteel, and there were no windows and no furniture, except a bench molded into the floor, and after they locked her inside, they posted 4 guards outside the door. Kira sat on the bench and put her head in her still-bound hands and tried to understand what had happened, and her face throbbed where Zekthur had struck her, and she could feel the swelling starting, but the pain seemed distant and unimportant compared to the crushing weight of what she had done. She had attacked a security officer, and she had broken his arm. She had taken his weapon, and she had done it all in front of hundreds of witnesses, and there was no explanation that would make this okay, and no apology that would fix it. The news spread faster than light, and within hours, every news network in the galaxy was running the footage, and Kira watched on the cell's wall screen as they played it over and over from every angle, and the headlines screamed, "Deathworlder attacks Academy Guard, and human violence erupts at Youth Academy. Is Earth too dangerous for the galactic community?" The footage showed Zekthur striking her, and that should have mattered, but it didn't seem to, because all anyone could focus on was the moment her eyes went black, and the speed of her response, and the ease with which she had disabled a trained security officer who outweighed her by 100 kilograms. Political analysts debated whether humans should be expelled from the Galactic Council, and security experts questioned why Deathworlders had been allowed into academy programs in the first place, and xenobiologists tried to explain human threat responses, but their explanations only seemed to make things worse. Dr. Yavin, a human biologist, appeared on one of the major networks, and she tried to help people understand, and she explained that humans had evolved on a world where almost everything was trying to kill them, and that their bodies had developed extreme survival mechanisms when a human perceives a serious threat. Dr. Javine said to the skeptical host, their body undergoes a cascade of changes, and the adrenal glands release hormones that increase strength and speed and pain tolerance. And this is called the fight-flight response, and it's automatic, so you're saying humans can't control themselves? The host said, and his tone made it clear what he thought of that. No, Dr. Javine said. Firmly, I'm saying that humans have very strong instincts, but they also have the capacity to override those instincts, and that's what makes us civilized. And Kira Chen demonstrated that capacity by stopping herself after she broke a security officer's arm, the host pointed out. After she was struck in the face hard enough to fracture bones in most species, Dr. Yavin countered. And after she showed remarkable restraint by not seriously injuring him when she easily could have. But her words were drowned out by the tide of fear and anger that was sweeping through the galactic community, and Earth's embassies reported increased harassment of human citizens, and several colonies requested that human residents leave voluntarily. And the Galactic Council called an emergency session to discuss the human problem. In her cell, Kira learned that her parents had been contacted, and that they were traveling from Earth as fast as they could, and that the human diplomatic corps had assigned a lawyer to her case, and that there would be a tribunal to determine her fate, possibly the fate of all humans in galactic society. She also learned from a sympathetic guard, who slipped her the information that Zichthar's injuries were not severe, and that his exoskeleton would heal completely, and that he had been treated and released, but that he was calling for her to be expelled from the academy and deported from Velanara, and possibly imprisoned. The guard also told her something else, and he spoke quietly so the others wouldn't hear, and he said that not everyone thought she was a monster, and that some people had noticed that Zichthar had struck first, and that the unedited security footage showed something important. That the news networks weren't talking about what? Kira asked, and her voice was rough from not speaking for hours. You could have killed him. The guard said simply, you're kind or strong enough, and you had him helpless, and you had his weapon, and you could have ended his life, and no one could have stopped you in time. I would never. Kira started, but the guard held up a hand. I know, he said. And that's what some of us are trying to tell people, and you stopped yourself, and that means something. He left before she could thank him, and Kira was alone again with her thoughts, and the wall screen showing her face on every channel and commentary that ranged from fearful to grateful to occasionally sympathetic. 3 days passed, and Kira was given food and water and medical treatment for her injuries. But she wasn't allowed visitors, and she wasn't allowed to communicate with anyone outside the cell, and she spent the hours reviewing every moment of the incident and wishing she had done something different. She wished she had seen Zichthar coming and avoided the collision entirely, and she wished she had moved faster when he struck her, so his blow had missed, and she wished she had stayed down and accepted whatever punishment he intended to give her instead of fighting back. But a small part of her, and a part that sounded like her father's voice, whispered that she had done nothing wrong, and that defending herself from an unprovoked attack was her right, and that Zichthar was the one who should be apologizing. On the 4th day they came for her, and they took her from the cell and loaded her into a transport, and she saw the academy grounds for the first time since the incident, and there were protesters at the gates, and some of them held signs calling for human expulsion, and others held signs defending her, and the two groups were shouting at each other. Transport took her to the Galactic Council's courthouse on the other side of the city, and the building was massive and built in the style of a dozen different architectural traditions, and it was supposed to represent unity and justice for all species. Kira was led through back corridors to avoid the crowds. She was taken to a preparation room where she finally saw friendly faces, and her parents were there. Her mother hugged her carefully, and her father gripped her shoulder and told her they were proud of her, and that everything would be okay. Her lawyer was a Velian named Silk, and she spoke in the soft tones of her species, and she explained that the tribunal would consist of 5 judges from 5 different species, and that they would hear testimony and review evidence, and then decide Kira's fate. The prosecution will argue that you're dangerous, Silk said gently. They'll say that humans are too violent for integration, and that this incident proves it. And they'll push for your expulsion, and possibly for restrictions on other humans. What do we argue, Kira's father? Ask the truth, Silk said. That Kira was attacked first, and that her response was proportional self-defense, and that she showed restraint when she could have caused much more harm. Will that be enough? Kira asked. Silk's wings fluttered in what might have been uncertainty, and she said, I don't know, and this is about more than just you now, and it's about whether the galaxy is ready to accept that being strong doesn't mean being evil. They had 15 minutes before the tribunal began, and Kira spent it with her parents and trying not to think about the fact that the next few hours might determine whether humanity had a future among the stars. The tribunal chamber was circular and built from pale stone that seemed to glow with its own light, and 5 elevated platforms held the judges who would decide Kira's fate, and behind them the council seal showed every member species of the galactic community, including the small blue world that was. Earth Judge Warmix presided, and he was a Thraxian. His crystalline body refracted the light into rainbow patterns, and his voice resonated through the chamber when he called the session to order and explained that they were here to determine the facts of the incident and to decide what justice required. The prosecution was led by Advocate Reshkal, and she was a Krivaxian, like Zeekther, and her mandibles clicked as she stood to present the case against Kira, and she began by playing the footage that everyone had already seen 1,000 times. You see here a clear case of Deathworld violence, Reshkal said, as the footage showed, Kira's eyes going black in her lightning-fast response. This human attacked a security officer without provocation and broke his arm and took his weapon and posed an immediate threat to everyone present. The footage shows Zeekther striking first. Silk objected from the defense table, a disciplinary tap. Reshkal dismissed. Standard protocol for student misconduct, and you can see the human deliberately collided with Officer Zeekther. When he attempted to correct her behavior, she responded with overwhelming violence. Reshkal called Zeekther as her first witness, and he took the stand with his arm in a medical brace, and he testified that Kira had been a problem student from the beginning, and that she had shown disrespect for academy rules, and that she had deliberately struck him and forced him to use corrective measures. And how did she respond to your correction? Reshkal asked. With the fury of a Deathworlder, Zeekther said her eyes went black, and she attacked me before I could defend myself, and she broke my arm and took my weapon, and if other students hadn't been present, I believe she would have killed me. Did you fear for your life? Reshkal asked. Absolutely, Zeekther said. Deathworlders are unpredictable and violent, and this is exactly why they shouldn't be allowed in civilized institutions. Silk stood for cross-examination, and her wings fluttered as she approached the witness stand, and she spoke gently, but there was steel underneath her soft voice. Officer Zeekther, how many times have you interacted with Kira Chen prior to this incident? Silk asked. Don't keep count, Zeekther said. Security officers interact with many students. Let me refresh your memory, Silk said, and she brought up academy records. You stopped her in the hallway 4 times in 6 months, and you questioned her. It's about her destination and her activities, and you filed 3 disciplinary reports against her for minor violations. And is that correct if the records say so? Zeekther said stiffly. And how many times? Did you stop other students in the same period? Silkesketchether hesitated, and then said, I don't have those numbers. I do, Silk said. You stopped other students a total of 12 times, and you filed 0 disciplinary reports, and so you interacted with Kira Chen 4 times as often as all other students combined. And do you consider that standard protocol? The human required more supervision, Zeekther said. Because she was breaking rules? Silk asked. Because she's a Deathworlder? Zeekther said, and then seemed to realize his mistake. Silk let that hang in the air before continuing, and she asked, Ow. You testified that Kira deliberately struck you, and can you describe exactly how this collision occurred? She turned suddenly and hit me with her shoulder, Zeekther said. And where were you standing when this happened? Silk asked. In the cafeteria near the recycling station, Ziegther said, were you moving or stationary? Silk pressed. I was walking through the area, Ziegther admitted so. Two people were moving and they collided, and how do you know it was deliberate on her part? Silk asked. I know Deathworlders, Ziegther said.
Oh.
They're always looking for conflict objections, Silk said. The witness is speculating about the defendants. State of mind, Judge Warmick sustained the objection and instructed Ziegther to stick to facts, and the cross-examination continued, and with each question, Silk revealed more of Ziegther's bias against humans and his pattern of harassment. The prosecution called several other witnesses who testified that they had seen Kira attack Ziegther, and that they had been frightened, and that they didn't feel safe with Deathworlders in the academy. And their testimony was damaging because fear was evident in every word. But then Silk began calling witnesses for the defense, and the first was Prism, and the Shardling's crystalline structure vibrated with emotion as she approached the stand. How long have you known Kira Chen? Silk asked since she arrived. At the academy 6 months ago, Prism said. We're roommates and friends. Tell us about your experience with her, Silk said. Prism's structure brightened as she spoke, and she described how Kira had helped her during a field trip when the gravity had been adjusted to Earth normal for a demonstration, and how Prism had collapsed because her crystalline structure couldn't support itself in such intense gravity. I was dying, Prism said. Simply my structure was fracturing, and the instructors were trying to lower the gravity, but it takes time. And Kira picked me up, and she carried me out of the gravity field, and her arms were strong enough to hold me without any effort, and she saved my life. Were you afraid of her? Silk asked at first. Yes, Prism admitted. Everyone told me Deathworlders were dangerous, and I believed it, but then I watched her. And I saw how careful she was, and how she moved slowly around us, and how she whispered when we would speak normally, and how she practiced holding things gently. Can you give an example? Silk asked. She broke 3 data pads in her first week, Prism said, just by gripping them normally. And after that, she spent hours every night practicing with different objects and learning exactly how much pressure she could use, and I've never seen anyone work so hard to not hurt people more. Students testified, and they told similar stories of Kira's gentleness and her patience and her determination to fit in despite being so different. And a Melundi student described how Kira had tutored him in mathematics even though she was behind in her own studies, because human mathematical notation was different. She gave up her free time to help me, the student said. And when I asked her why, she said that's what friends do, and I don't think monsters have friends like that. The tribunal recessed for the day, and Kira sat with her parents and Silk in the preparation room and tried not to hope too much because hope hurt when it was crushed. You have good friends, Silk said. Their testimony is helping, but we need more, and we need to show what really happened. The footage shows everything, Kira said. The edited footage shows what the prosecution wants people to see, Silk corrected. But there are hours of security recordings from that day and from the weeks before, and if we can access them, we might find what we need. That night, Prism and several other students worked in secret, and they used skills that weren't exactly legal to access the Academy's full security archives, and what they found changed everything. The next morning, Silk requested an emergency presentation of new evidence, and Judge Wormix allowed it, and the chamber watched as new footage appeared on the screens. It showed Ziegther watching Kira from across the cafeteria and calculating the timing and moving to intercept her path and positioning himself exactly where the collision would occur, and the footage clearly showed him stepping into her path at the last moment. More footage showed weeks of harassment and Ziegther deliberately bumping into Kira and making comments just out of range of security microphones and filing false reports about her behavior and building a pattern of documented misconduct that didn't match reality. The footage showed Ziegther meeting with 3 other Kravoxians late at night in restricted areas, and the audio captured their conversation and their plan to provoke Kira into a response that would discredit all humans. We prove they're violent, one of them said, and the council will have no choice but to expel them, and Earth will be isolated again, and the Deathworlders will be contained.
Nice.
The chamber erupted, and Judge Wormix called for order, and Reshgal objected that the footage was obtained illegally, and Silk countered that the truth of the evidence mattered more than how it was obtained. This tribunal is tasked with finding justice. Judge Wormick said, and justice requires truth, and I'm allowing. The evidence, the final piece of footage, showed the incident itself from a different angle, and it showed Kira's face when Zeekther struck her, and it showed genuine shock and pain, and then the change as her survival instincts took over. And it also showed the moment when she stopped herself. Freeze there, Silk said, and the image froze with Kira on top of Zeekther and her hand raised. Every person in the chamber could see that her hand was positioned to strike his vulnerable thorax, and that such a strike would have been fatal. She could have killed him, Silk said quietly. By law, by right, by any measure of self-defense, she could have ended his life, and she chose not to. And that choice is what defines her, and that choice is what should define how we see all humans. The revelation of Zeekther's conspiracy sent shockwaves through the tribunal and the galactic community. Watching the proceedings, and suddenly the narrative shifted from dangerous Deathworlder attacks, innocent guard, to something far more complex. And troubling Judge Wormick called a recess to review the new evidence, and the other 4 judges joined him in chambers, while the courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations, and Kira sat at the defense table, trying to process the fact that Zeke had planned the entire thing. He wanted this, she said to Silk. He wanted me to attack him. Oh. He wanted you to prove his point about humans being violent, Silk agreed. But you did the opposite, and you proved that humans can choose restraint even when their instincts scream for violence, and that's more powerful than he anticipated. When the tribunal reconvened, Judge Wormick announced that they would be expanding the scope of the proceedings, and that instead of simply determining Kira's guilt or innocence, they would be examining the broader question of human integration into galactic society. This incident has raised important questions, Wormick said. Questions about whether we truly understand the species we share the galaxy within, questions about what it means to be civilized, and we will hear expert testimony on these matters before rendering judgment. The prosecution objected but was overruled, and over the next 3 days, the tribunal became something more like a classroom and a forum, and experts from dozens of fields testified about humanity and Earth and what it meant to evolve on a Deathworld ductor. Yavin returned, and this time she had hours instead of minutes to explain, and she brought data and charts and holographic models of human biology, and she walked the tribunal through millions of years of evolution. Earth's gravity is twice what most species consider normal. She explained the atmosphere has high oxygen content that would be toxic to many of you, and the temperature swings from freezing to scorching, and the native life forms include persistence predators who can chase prey for days, and ambush predators who can strike faster than most species can perceive, and venomous creatures whose toxins can kill in minutes. She showed images of Earth's animals, and there were gasps from the gallery when they saw lions and crocodiles and sharks and even seemingly harmless creatures like hippos and cassowaries that killed more humans than the predators did. To survive on this world, humans developed several key adaptations, Dr. Yavin continued. Exceptional endurance that allows them to run for hours without stopping, and rapid healing that can close wounds in days that would take other species weeks, and extreme pain tolerance that lets them continue functioning with injuries that would incapacitate most species, and most importantly, the threat response system. She explained how human adrenal glands worked and how the fight or flight response could temporarily increase strength by up to 40%, and how pain receptors could be suppressed, and how vision and hearing sharpened to detect threats. But here's what's crucial to understand, Dr. Yavin said, and she looked directly at the judges. Every species in this galaxy has survival instincts, and the difference with humans isn't that their instincts are stronger, but that they've had to develop equally strong systems for overriding those instincts. Explained Judge Wormick requested humans are pack animals. Dr. Yavin said they evolved in groups where cooperation was essential for survival, and this meant they needed to be able to suppress their individual threat responses for the good of the group, and a human who attacked every member of their tribe would be expelled and would die alone. She showed studies of human children learning to control their impulses and learning to share and learning to resolve conflicts without violence, and she showed brain scans highlighting the prefrontal cortex where humans made conscious decisions to override their instincts. What you saw in that cafeteria was both systems operating. Dr. Yavin concluded Kira's instincts responded to a genuine threat in her conscious mind, reasserted control, and the fact that she stopped herself is not unusual for a human, and it's exactly what we would expect from someone properly socialized. The prosecution brought their own expert, a xenopsychologist named Felonier, who argued that humans were fundamentally incompatible with galactic civilization because their capacity for violence was too great. Even if they can control themselves most of the time, Fellner argued the potential for catastrophic failure is always present, and one human having a bad day could kill dozens of others before being stopped, and is that a risk we should accept? But on cross-examination, Silk got Felonier to admit that every species had individuals who committed violence, and that the statistical rate of human violent crime was actually lower than several other council species, so humans are less violent on average than, say, the Melundi, Silk said, and yet no one is calling for Melundi to be expelled from the council. The Melundi don't have the physical capacity to cause as much damage, Felonier countered. So your argument is that we should discriminate against humans not because they're more violent, but because they're stronger, Silk said. Is that what galactic civilization has come to? The question hung in the air, and many in the gallery shifted uncomfortably because Silk had exposed the ugly truth at the heart of the anti-human sentiment the tribunal heard. From human soldiers who had served in joint peacekeeping operations and who described working alongside aliens to stop conflicts and protect civilians, and they heard from human medics who had rushed into dangerous situations to save alien lives. When other species held back in fear, they heard from the captain of a colony ship who described how human crew members had manually sealed a hull breach in vacuum conditions that would have killed any other species, and how those humans had saved 300 alien colonists at the cost of severe injuries to themselves. They didn't hesitate. The captain testified they saw people in danger, and they acted. And their strength and endurance meant they could do what others couldn't, and without them everyone on that ship would have died. A human teacher named James Chen, who was Kira's uncle, testified about the training all human children received before being allowed to interact with aliens, and he described years of practice learning to control their strength and moderate their voices and move carefully in spaces designed for more fragile species. We teach our children that being strong is a responsibility. James said that they have to be more careful and more controlled than others because the consequences of carelessness are greater, and Kira took that lesson to heart, and she spent 6 months being so careful that she bruised herself rather than risk hurting anyone else, and yet she still attacked a security officer, Reshkul said on cross-examination. She defended herself from an unprovoked assault, James corrected, and then she stopped when she could have continued. And that's the most important part that everyone seems to want to ignore. The tribunal also heard from the 3 other Kravaxians who had conspired with Zeekther, and they had been arrested after the footage was revealed, and they testified in exchange for reduced charges. They described a faction within the Kravaxian government that opposed human integration and that feared humans would eventually dominate the council through their physical advantages, and they admitted that. Zeekther had volunteered to create an incident that would turn public opinion against humans, we thought. If people saw how dangerous they really are, one of them testified, they would understand that we can't trust them, and that they need to be kept away from our worlds and our children. And did it work? Silk asked. The Kravaxian looked at his feet and said no. And people saw a young girl who defended herself and then showed mercy, and that's not what we expected. On the final day of testimony, Judge Wormick surprised everyone by calling Kira to the stand, and she walked up on shaking legs and swore to tell the truth and waited for the questions. Miss Chen, Wormick said, and his crystalline voice was gentle. Tell us what you were thinking when Officer Zeekther struck you. Kira took a breath and tried to find the words for something. She had barely understood herself, and she said, At first I was just shocked because I didn't expect it, and then there was pain, and then there was nothing. Nothing, Wormick's prompted. Nothing like thoughts, Kira clarified. Just instinct, and my body took over, and it knew I was in danger, and it knew how to respond, and I was almost watching from outside myself as I moved. "When did you regain control?" Wormix asked. "When he was on the ground," Kira said, and I had his weapon, and I looked at him. And suddenly I could think again, and I realized what I'd done, and I was horrified. "Why were you horrified?" Wormix asked. "You had been attacked, and you defended yourself because I proved them right," Kira said, and her voice broke everyone who said humans are too violent and too dangerous, and I spent 6 months trying to show them we're not, and then I destroyed it all in 3 seconds. "Did you want to hurt Officer Zekther?" Wormix asked. "No," Kira said firmly. "I never wanted to hurt anyone, and I just wanted to fit in and make friends and prove that humans belong here, and if you could go back to that moment." Wormix asked, "What would you do differently?"